This is Rick Malone for the San Francisco Symphony. Banned and boycotted. Ever since humans began making art, we've had opinions about it. Art appreciation is, after all, subjective, and many works of art that are considered masterpieces today were met with scorn, hostility, or outrage by their original audiences. For instance, Beethoven's Second Symphony was described as a hideously writhing dragon that refuses to die, and Tchaikovsky's Violin Concerto was referred to as proof that there could be music that stinks to the ear. But sometimes works of art fall on the wrong side of the law, or at least the wrong side of official favor, especially since the beginning of the 20th century, when governments began to take a more active interest in the art their people consumed and how it could be manipulated to serve the government's own interests. Arts policy in the Soviet Union under Stalin was committed to the idea that to be worth anything, a work had to make a political or ideological statement, of course, a correct one. Artists who did not toe the party line could be subject to public criticism, prison, or even execution. Dmitri Shostakovich spent his life falling in and out of favor with the Soviet artistic authorities. The success of his first symphony made him a national hero at 19. But 10 years later, his opera Lady Macbeth of Mtsensk angered Stalin and his music police so much that Shostakovich was officially and publicly condemned for what the authorities called chaos instead of music, formalism, and anti-Soviet tendencies. The opera was banned for 30 years. In 1937, Shostakovich was briefly rehabilitated after the premiere of his Fifth Symphony, which was called A Soviet Artist's Creative Response to Just Criticism. But he'd already learned that in order to survive, he had to split his musical personality in two, a public, acceptable side, and a very private, more personal one that he had to keep hidden. Many of the works he wrote in this more personal style ended up hidden away for years. Shostakovich wrote his Violin Concerto in 1947 and 48, during a period in which he was once again being bullied and threatened by the authorities. After World War II and the victory over the Nazis, the government expected celebratory music, so Shostakovich realized that the dark and somber tone of the concerto's opening the anguished variations of the third movement and the sarcastic farce of the finale would probably not be viewed favorably, but it was the second movement scherzo that was probably the most dangerous part of the work. In this movement, Shostakovich uses German musical notation to spell out his initials. Dmitri Shostakovich, DSCH, where S stands in for E flat and H for B natural. Many composers, especially Bach and Schumann, wrote works using musical code for their names, or the names of loved ones. But in the Soviet Union of 1948, the cult of personality was permitted only to Stalin, and any attempt by Shostakovich to call attention to himself in his music would have met with harsh disapproval. 5 years later, Stalin was dead, and Shostakovich wrote a devastating portrait of the dictator into his Symphony No. 10, inspired in part by this movement. But in 1948, the time was not right, so he put the finished manuscript in a drawer, and it stayed there for 7 years. When he finally did publish it, he gave it an opus number that reflected the dark times in which it was actually written, as a reminder of why it was hidden for so long. But disapproval does not have to be official to be effective. In 1918, Bela Bartok was inspired to write his ballet The Miraculous Mandarin, based on a story by the naturalist writer Menyert Lengel. After the brutality of World War I, modern art in Central Europe was all about the ability to shock, and the naturalists in particular embraced the extremes of sex, psychosis, and horror. In Lengel's story, a gang of thugs uses a girl to lure men to their flat where they beat and rob them. After 2 unsuccessful attempts with a foolish old man and a young boy who has no money, their next victim is a prosperous-looking Chinese. He's aroused by the girl and chases her around the flat. The thugs grab him, beat him, and steal his money and jewels, then stab him repeatedly, but he won't die. They try to smother him with a blanket and then hang him, but he keeps pursuing the girl. Finally, as the synopsis puts it, the girl satisfies his desire, and only then does he collapse and die. End quote. Lengel was a very successful writer, but he was tremendously insecure, with an almost pathological fear of failure. And at one point, he was a patient of Sigmund Freud's best-known Hungarian pupil. So if the plot of The Miraculous Mandarin seems like an obsessive nightmare, there's a good reason. And it's no wonder that it took 7 years for the ballet to be produced, and even longer in Hungary. No one would touch it because of the subject matter. When it finally did premiere in Cologne in 1926, the audience was outraged, and church officials were so offended that it was closed down after only 1 performance. It was staged in Prague in 1927, but then not again for another 19 years. There were attempts to stage it in Budapest in 1931 and 1941, but Bartok himself shut down the first attempt because he wasn't happy with the production. State censors made sure the second attempt went nowhere. Both Bartok and Shostakovich were national heroes, but their status was still no match for the power of the people and the power of the state to affect their careers and their lives. This is Rick Malone for the San Francisco Symphony.